welcome to the real estate panel. We have a really fantastic group of people. I'm just going to quickly introduce them and then we're going to kick this off and hopefully still end relatively on time. So today we're going to be talking about affordable housing innovation. We have Dan Issenbaum, who's an alum right here from Goldman Sachs Urban Investment Group. We have Kay Matheny, who now is at HRNA Advisors, but formerly Deputy Commissioner and Chief of Staff of HPD, the housing agency. We have Bob Santa of Forest City Ratner, and Adam Weinstein of Phipps Community Development Corporation. And we are moderated here today by Leanne Lockman, who's an executive in residence at Columbia Business School. Welcome, thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning and welcome to the session on affordable housing. I just want to express my appreciation to the wonderful panel that has agreed to come up to campus this morning. And so we all thank you, and we're going to just start right in. And you have some background material, so we're not going to do elaborate introductions because we really want to spend time on content. And however, you should be structuring your questions because there will be plenty of time for Q&A toward the end. So to set the stage, Dan Issenbaum is going to summarize the demand side of the affordable housing equation. And then the remaining panel members will focus on how that demand is being and could be met. So, Dan, let's get started.
All right, okay. Good morning, everybody. It's pretty easy to talk about the problems and challenges in affordable housing. Probably tell you a lot of things you don't know. But I thought in the context of the mayoral election, we could frame it as follows. So I think if you just imagine that you are the new mayor, whoever that might be, it seems like a close race. You might imagine yourself in your first day of office when your deputy chief of staff walks in and says, you wanted to talk about housing, we've got bad news and maybe a little bit of good news. So here's the bad news, which I think helps frame the dimensions of the challenges and speaks a little bit to the demand side, as Lynn said. So here's some statistics that I think help frame it. There is, as you probably know, a 3% vacancy rate out there in the market for rental housing. Obviously, for affordable housing, it's significantly less. 50% of New Yorkers are paying more than a third of their income, which is the relative standard we all use, a third of their income on housing, and frankly, 33% are paying more than 50% of their income for housing. In terms of homeowners, the foreclosure rate in New York City exceeds 6%. Foreclosures actually had an uptick between 2011 and 2012, and over 15% of owner-occupied homes in the last year or so were underwater, quote unquote, meaning the principal amount of their mortgage was greater than the value of their home. There's 50,000 people in New York City's shelter system. In terms of the homeless population. There's 225,000 people on the New York City Housing Authority's waiting list. Building owners are experiencing increases in operating expenses, which obviously can lead to reduced maintenance or passing through those expenses to the extent they can. We're in an environment, by the way, I'm going to get to good news, so I hope you're listening and taking in all this bad news. We're certainly in a strong market more generally, which is pricing not only lower income people out of housing, but moderate or middle income people out of housing, with the average rent now at about $3,000 in terms of rental apartments. We're clearly in an environment that is challenged in terms of subsidies, be it the city, the state, or the federal government. It's not even worth talking about what's happening on the federal level, but you can imagine it's got significant impacts and adverse effects. While we're trying to think about creating new units of affordable housing, we're experiencing the expiration of subsidized properties. So while we've had some production programs, we are losing affordable units that will come out of Section 8 or Richland, et cetera. We can talk a little bit about that. We certainly have huge challenges with NYCCA, where there's 180,000 units of housing containing almost 400,000 people, chronically underfunded. And given what's happening in terms of Sandy, where there's significant damage to those units, we're just talking about in East New York and Queens, that's a huge challenge. And by the way, this is all in the context of having just finished the mayor's plan for housing, which created or preserved 165,000 units of housing. So we've got all these challenges in that context of having just completed those totals. So where might we find the good news? So I'm trying to outline a little bit all the challenges, which I think reflects the demand side. The good news, and I hope that we'll illustrate some of this, is that New York City has had a long history in terms of having the most progressive approach to affordable housing. We have a city budget and the capital budget which supports affordable housing. We have a deep industry of for-profit developers and not-for-profit developers who've worked with cities, state, and federal programs to help with production. We have a city housing finance agency that is probably among the leaders in the country, if not the leading housing finance agency in the country, with access to tax-exempt bonds and tax credits. There are a range of state programs. There's a question about how well they align with city programs in some ways. We have a range of tools from tax incentives to tax credits to zoning that will help us create affordable housing. And you have a concentration in New York City of highly motivated banks because of CRA, which have provided debt and equity to support affordable housing. And a strong overall real estate market, which hopefully we'll talk about some mixed income housing or some inclusionary zoning, which allows us to leverage that market force to create affordable housing. So anybody in those positions and all of us in the industry have to think about that balance and who you're going to try to serve. Is it low income? Is it middle income? We joked a little bit, or maybe I just joked a little bit in our preparation. I think you saw the difference between Quinn's plan and her focus on middle income, and de Blasio's focus in terms of the more needy and where people seem to be trending in terms of thinking about where the need actually is. So I hope today we'll talk a little bit about these broad forces and how we can try to address them.
Great, thanks, Dan. Now we're going to turn to the supply side and 3 different approaches to providing supply, and then move more broadly. So let's start with Adam and Hunters Point South, which is a joint venture with the related companies.
And Monadnock Construction.
Okay.
Don't forget.
And if you'll just do a quick summary, that'd be great.
Sure. It's not a typical project. I'll start with that. And it starts with cheap land. Land, of course, land prices reflecting demand in any market or sub-market. It's land that was purchased by the city from the state, originally with the intention of building the Olympic Village. Right, it's right on the Queens waterfront facing the UN. Obviously, the 2012 Olympics never happened. The city sat around with the land and agreed, somewhat miraculously, to restrict its value. And all affordable housing at some point is a discussion of how do we impair market value? How do we trade market value for something that we think is a public policy or a public good? In this instance, the city determined that it would make the land available for free through a request for proposal. And the basis for the request for proposal was twofold. It was how many affordable units can be produced, and then the city always offers a second criterion for its competitions, and it's a phrase I love because it's meaningless. It is greatest affordability for least cost. And no matter if you ask any government bureaucrat in the city's housing agencies, what does greatest affordability for least cost mean? No one has an answer. And I could ask each of you, and you would all come up with a different one. Is it based on deepest subsidy, reaching the lowest of the low, as Dan mentioned, or is it greatest number of units across a spread? Our team determined that we were going to maximize the number of units that would be restricted forever. rather than cross-subsidizing, rather than making, the RFP permitted you to make 40% of the apartments available to market rate renters. We determined that we wanted to make 100% of our units restricted. Now that's a tricky bargain because at a certain point you're reducing rent, which impairs your ability to borrow, raise private capital. It also brought an additional city subsidy for us that we thought would offset that well. And accordingly, of the 925 units in the development, the top 40% are what I would call market-ish. They are about, depending on the apartment size, between 10 to 20% less expensive than the market. Than what would be, when I say market, I mean unrestricted apartment in a sub-market rented off the street, or what folks refer to as street rent. But the advantage of this is that we all think of this as a moment in time, when in fact it's a moving picture. And we all see how the moving picture of regulation of rent plays out, and in one other means of controlling affordability that Dan didn't touch on, and that is price regulation that comes along with rent regulation. In our case, it's pretty clear what happens over time. If you offer a household a rent they can afford, over time, incomes tend to rise faster than rents. So as a rental landlord, which is what Phipps is, it happens to be a not-for-profit rental landlord, I believe that's wealth building. I'm not sure I buy the full value of the American dream because for years and years and years, immigrants have been coming to New York City, a high turnover town, my grandparents did, and renting an apartment. That's the first thing you do. You don't have capital, you don't know how to, put down a down payment, you're not bankable, you rent an apartment, you build wealth. We think that this theory pertains to Hunters Point South as well. So 40% of the units are at a slight discount to market. The next 20% of the units are what we would refer to as moderate income. Those are households ranging between the area's median income, which is for a household of 4 in New York City, slightly more than $70,000, up to 130%. So another 30%, help me out here, is $91,000. And then at the lowest level, at the final 20% of the apartments are available to households earning less than 50% of the area median income. Putting that layer cake together is what we do. That's precisely what we do. Trying to figure out ways in which you can optimize your capital structure, because at the very beginning, you go on the going in. Even with a subsidized land cost, it is very, very difficult to build affordable housing with purely private market sources. If the rents are restricted, how could you possibly borrow enough to take out your construction financing to make this work?
Okay.
Okay.
So very inexpensive land is crucial.
Essential.
To your project. But now we'll switch to Bob with Forest City, and you're turning to modular, or do you also have cheaper land? This is Atlantic Yards, so we're in Brooklyn.
So Atlantic Yards is a smallest project in downtown Brooklyn. That's approximately 6,400 units of housing that's anchored by the Barclays Center. About 2,200 of those units are affordable in 5 different income bands. We'd like to think that we had cheap land as well, but as many know, there was an extraordinary amount of infrastructure that went along with the entitlements for that property. For instance, we had to pick up the staging yard of the Long Island Railroad and move it down the street at a cost of about $500 million. There was a new subway station for Atlantic Yards for the 2, 3, 4, and 5 train. There was sewer and water infrastructure that all went around the property, and of course all the demolition and the cost associated with the long litigation and eminent domain process. So for Forest City, that really is what our land cost is, at the basis of our land cost. And that could be quite extraordinary and makes affordable housing difficult. And as I said, that Atlantic Yards really looks to have about 20% affordable housing in the project. So without having affordable land, we're looking at other ways to do it. And one of the complications that we have is it is 6,000 units over nominally 10, 12 years, depending on what the EIS tells you. But you're pro-forming and projecting costs today and building them many years later. So if you were doing this assignment in 2007, 2008, construction costs would be one. If you did it today, they would be very different. And that is because New York City is one of the highest costs of construction in the country. It's also that high cost is fueled by the fact that we build very tall buildings. We have a limited supply of contractors that could do this work. And for Atlantic Yards, once again, a prevailing weight project has to be built all union. There's another complication of finding a vendor that can perform the work that's a union contractor. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure when you go out to bid to create lower costs. And so we've started our first project, B2, which is 330 units of housing. And in order to sort of look at that construction cost, we've looked to a modular solution. And in this particular case, we're manufacturing about 900 modules that form about 330 apartments in the building. These are manufactured off-site at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We were able to make a deal with the union labor so that they've created a modular division, if you will. So that enables us to continue to build. And that process of building off-site creates a level of efficiency. We do have a little bit more of a competitive wage point in the factory, but creates a level of efficiency and takes some of the irregularity out of the construction process to stabilize that piece. So, you know, affordable, cheap land is one way to do it. If you can't really have the cheap land, you have to focus on the construction costs. So we've reached to a prefabricated solution to try to mitigate some of that over the long haul.
Now, modular has been around for years, and planners always think it's going to take off for just these reasons, and it hasn't. Do you think it's different this time?
I do think it's different this time. Yes, modular's been around. Frank Lloyd Wright fooled around with Sears. Moshe Safdie made a big deal of this in the 70s. So it's always been in the back of every architect's dream. But I think a couple of things have changed that will enable it to happen. I think number one is technology. We now have building information modeling and technology that allows us to fabricate components to a high degree of accuracy off-site. So a project that we built downtown, the Geary Tower down at Beekman. The exterior, while that building was built conventionally, the rather elaborate facade of that building was built off-site at 3 different facilities, one in China where the stainless steel came from, and with the aid of a model, we were able to really create 10,000 different panels to a high degree of accuracy to assemble it. So I think technology has changed, has been a game changer for prefabrication. I think the second game changer also is sustainability. I think there's no doubt that the modular approach limits waste, limits the amount of on-site disruption. Particularly at Atlantic Yards, we're building in a very dense urban neighborhood, and construction is particularly invasive to the neighborhood. So finding a solution that takes 60% of that activity away from the site, I also think is a big component of it. And last but not least, I do think that as in high construction cost markets like New York City, where there's a limited amount of suppliers, and then competition from non-union vendors, I do think that more vendors will look to aggregating building systems such that they can bring those efficiencies to the building construction. Building construction has been so far behind every other industry in terms of innovation, and I think this is the first time that the technology really allows that to play itself out on the site.
And you're making an investment in the modular business. You're not just doing a project.
We would have loved to just go out and buy a product and bring it. We are developers, not manufacturers, but we recognize there was really no competitive place to get this done. And so since 6,000 units is a nice pipeline, one of the things modular suffers from is having a stable pipeline. So with 6,000 units of housing, we suddenly had the pipeline, and we did embark on a 2-year research and development project which ended up creating a business. We're now a joint venture with Skanska Construction. They're our 50/50 partner on this, and created a new business. FCS Modular exists in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It created 125 jobs there. It's primarily an assembly facility. We take products from all over the United States and assemble the unit there, so we're not really manufacturing, but it fit in very, very nicely to the agenda of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, what our goals are, so it's worked out rather nicely. But it only made sense to make that investment, the big capital investment, because we had the pipeline to really support the manufacturing. Hopefully, we'll have other customers.
Well, Adam might become a customer.
Not at their cost per square foot.
Okay, Kay, before you left the city a week ago,
Yes.
You were focusing on the mayor's and the city's micro-unit project, which has gotten a lot of press. Other West Coast cities have been doing the same thing. You want to give a summary of that as an answer?
Sure. Yeah, and and in fact, other cities around the world have been doing micro units as well as modular, and this is both micro and modular. So, going back to Dan's framing of this, the premise behind the ADAPT initiative is so the project itself is a pilot to really test the boundaries and show ways that we can adapt the housing models to try to build more supply and think differently about how we build to meet the supply, meet the demand that's out there with different types of supply. And so we really started looking at the small household populations of the city. Almost 50% of the city is a small household, which is 1 to 2 person households. Certain areas in Manhattan are upwards of 80% small households. And a small household isn't just low income. It's a whole breadth of aging, seniors, people leaving college, and everything in between. There are a lot of singles who come to New York for a lot of different reasons. And so this isn't necessarily an affordable housing initiative. It's more about the macro supply and demand. Having said that, small households, because of the disparity in supply and demand, have a disproportionately higher rent than larger households because there's not enough small households out there. So today I believe there are 1.8 million 1 and 2 family households in the city and only 1 million studios in 1 bedroom. So what we were trying to do is say, how can we, given all of the challenges that we face with housing, lack of land supply, how can we think differently about how we're building so we can build more densely to meet the demand? And so the micro-unit project was one of a couple different ideas of thinking about how we can advance or change our housing models. And what we wanted to do was be good government and really think differently and push boundaries, but do so in a moderate way. And so we said, let's pilot this concept. It's a 55-unit building. It's not huge. It's not Hunters Point South or Atlantic Yards even for that matter. It's on a small 50 by 100 foot property in Phipps Bay, which is on the east side in the high 20s. And the idea was really to put a competition out there to look at building an all micro-unit project and thinking differently about design. So a lot of people live in studios of this size today in New York. The difference is you can't build a building full of them. And a lot of the studios that people are living in aren't necessarily built as efficiently with the technology considerations or design for that matter. And so the idea was to really put it out there to say build as much affordable as you can at the lowest cost. Same language as Adam was referring to before.
Greatest affordability.
Greatest affordability with no subsidy. That was part of the competition too.
Sure.
And so, but the idea was to push boundaries and to push thinking and to use not just financing or land costs, but design and creative thinking and construction to see what we could come up with. And so the project is still going through the public planning and review and approval process. We can talk about that later if you're interested. There's been some pushback. It's not so straightforward. We're hoping to break ground at the end of the year. And really what we're hoping to do is use this, and we've been thrilled with the feedback and the popularity, and we're hoping that this does catalyze larger thinking. We've seen tremendous support and around the world. And even though modular and micro units aren't new, I feel like this has reinvigorated a conversation, at least in the press and with cities and thinking about urban construction and smart, dense ways, which is exciting. New York wasn't the first, but I feel like we're being put out there as kind of a leader in this. We'll take credit for that. That's probably not true. And so it's really about forcing the dialogue. And the other piece of the kind of the good government part of what we were trying to do was, recognizing kind of the practicality of the end of the administration, the limitations of being able to only do so much with the time that we had. We had about 2 years left. We knew we were not going to do wholesale changes to the building code to allow, or maybe that even made sense, but that we didn't have time to really pursue this in a holistic, large-scale way, but that by creating this pilot concept, we could test the ideas, we could test the financial feasibility of doing an all-micro-unit building, we could test the affordability and find, and whether or not it required subsidy. We could test the demand to see if people would be interested in living in it, and then really try to force the dialogue for the next administration to start thinking differently about changing the building and zoning codes. And so I'll just quickly frame the two issues and the challenges with why you can't build a micro-unit building in the city today. One is around, the primary one is really around zoning and zoning density. And you currently can't build a full building with micro-units. The average density zoning space per person has to be greater than one studio today in a building. So in other words, you have to have an average or sort of a mix of studios, 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms to have a full per capita square footage per person in a building. So you have to have a unit mix in buildings today. And the idea is to try to create kind of mixed households and that sort of thing, and not too much density in one place. So we're waiving that with a mayoral override to allow for the micro-unit building. But then there are also other building and construction challenges with the small spaces and light and air and access, and there are a lot of rules around kind of separation of space and use that make building like this really challenging. But what we're hoping to do is really shift the dialogue a bit for the next administration.
Well, I have to ask, Phipps Bay has lots of interns for hospitals, and they spend hardly any time at home, and so that makes some sense. But aren't you in danger of creating new tenements by making it all micro units?
We don't think so. I think there's certainly a legacy and a negative connotation and a history of tenements in the city. And so a lot of the rules that have evolved, the zoning and building codes have evolved to prevent tenements, right? And really the only legal way to do something like this now is if it's supportive housing and there are services and other operating oversights built in to the building. And this is not the case. And so, I think what's different about this is, as I said, people live in studios like this all over the city today. And they're not necessarily designed smartly or efficiently. It's going to be a gorgeous building. It's very thoughtful. There's a lot of light and air. I think they're quite desirable places to live. A lot of people, if you've gone to the Museum of the City of New York, we have a model that's there, and people continually say how impressed they are with the size and the scale, and it's a very livable space. And so, and it's also in an active neighborhood. It will have a lot of both use within the individual units and as well as within the building. So there's a lot of common space, common activities, a lot of work that we're doing along, there's a kind of a pedestrian walkway to build that up and create activity. And I think, really what we're hoping to do is integrate into the neighborhood, and the individual units themselves are contained. A lot of the SRO models were shared bathroom, other kind of shared facilities, shared kitchen, and more of a bedroom type unit. These are self-contained bedroom, bathroom, living, kitchen units. So there's not the kind of back and forth that's there. And we're also hoping to, it will be managed just like any other regulated building. So, around leases and tenancy, and the idea is that it's really just managed in a regular way, that it's not a transient population.
Okay. We will see.
We shall see.
And we'll see if other people come and want a mayoral override.
We shall also see that.
To do more such projects. Well, let's come back to the demand side and who we should be serving with a limited new supply of affordable housing. And maybe starting at the higher end, are we seriously trying to keep middle-income people in the city of New York. And I think that's more easily done in the non-Manhattan boroughs. But is that part of the strategy? And I would just throw that open to everybody. I don't know, Dan, if you want to jump in. Or.
So I think there are many answers to that. I think, you know, in all of these conversations, we're talking about people with different bands of income, low income, 50% of area median income, moderate income, 80% of area median income. Clearly, you need to serve a variety of different segments. You cannot concentrate all of your resources in one place. I think everybody believes, whether you're talking about citywide or even in RFPs like Hunter's Point or others, income integration, economic integration is really sort of crucial for our neighborhoods and for the city. So I think you clearly need to support different bands of income and serve different segments of the city, whether you're creating an aspirational path or whether you're just trying to attract people to the city. And there also needs to be some sort of mix of home ownership and rental. And we really haven't talked about the home ownership sector as well. Keep in mind, by the way, that an attraction or retention strategy for middle-income people or low-income people is clearly not just around housing. It's also about the quality of schools. It's also about safety. There's a lot of different elements here. And part of, I think, what's exciting about where we're going with some of these developments is that we are creating different types of broadly defined redevelopments, whether it's Seward Park, again, Hunter's Point, other places, where we're thinking about mixes of buildings, reclamation of underused land, and we're really creating neighborhoods with a higher quality of housing that I think serve different levels of incomes.
Just picking up on the ownership versus rental, you've got a project, Via Verde, that did both, which is pretty unusual in
I'll
New
talk
York's
about that in a
experience.
second, but Dan won't be surprised to hear that I'll take issue with what he said.
He was just waiting, by the way.
And here's why. First of all, the conversation is too small when limited to a building. It's frankly too small when limited to a neighborhood. Or for that matter, maybe you're starting to think about it a little bit when you're referring to a city of 8 million, but I would actually make it a regional conversation. The region's health has always depended upon, and any economic, cities exist for economic reasons. They're places of commerce, and they supply jobs, and that's what drives the whole thing. And if you don't have a range of opportunities for people to live relatively close to their jobs, you have trouble. This is, the big problem of places like Seattle and Aspen, Colorado. New York, and the problem there is one of transit and schools. And safety a little bit. Dan is correct about that. I'm not keen on recreating a neighborhood, a Jane Jacobsian view of the world in every single building. For that matter, I'm not a really keen fan of our project at Hunters Point South. I go back to saying, at some point, if you're going to create housing for people who can't otherwise afford the market rent, there are two things that people do. They go seek places where land is cheaper. And incidentally, you can do that all over the city. There's a crisis of imagination out there as to where people live. I live in Spuyten Duyvil in the Bronx. That's a cool, affordable place to live. And you can live there. If you're a middle-income household, you can live there as a single, you can live there as a senior, you can live there and raise a family. Everything is not Manhattan. Everything is not parts of Brooklyn that have become hot to live. The tougher challenge, of course, is creating housing, and this is where I come out on the spectrum, for people for whom paying rent after they cover their housing costs at Dan's ratio of 30% of the household median income, a standard across, and lenders, rental landlords across the country. Folks who only have a little bit of discretionary income left over after that are the supplied jobs here, or filled jobs that are important to and vital to our economy. They may be entry-level-ish. They may be a starting teacher. They may be a health aide. They may be a starting out cop who makes only $29,000. That's the segment that I'm principally interested in. And if you go about putting a lot of expensive housing or expensive construction types in neighborhoods where the disparity between restricted value and market value is so great, there's going to be a distortion. Someone's going to subsidize that. And it is the most grotesque example of that can be found in affordable home ownership housing that was built in the Mitchell-Lama program. Has anyone ever heard of the Mitchell-Lama program? It was a bond financing program that the state pioneered for middle-income renters in the 1950s. Really, it coincided with urban flight a little bit, and it was a panic. It was a panic move. And I own 3 Mitchell-Lamas, so I can tell you with certainty that it was a way of creating permanently restricted affordable housing for people who probably don't need it.
Well,
And if you
the
layer,
idea was to keep
to answer your question about
them
home
in the
ownership,
city.
but why? In the city? You mean in the neighborhood in which they currently
Roosevelt
live?
Island.
So here's the distortion of it. If you and rent stabilize, and I'm an affordable housing guy. Rent stabilization is, to me, a means of price restricting without regard to ability to pay. I'm much more interested in trying to focus on people who are going to have a hard time living here or have to live in the Poconos, right, and commute 2 hours a day. That's not sustainable, to use Bob's word. Affordable home ownership takes public resources and gives it to a person. We're a rental town, high cost of land, high regulation, difficulty assembling capital, and if you ascribe to my belief, which is that a cheap rent is wealth building over some period of time, and by the way, rent stabilization applies in all my buildings and therefore gives a tenant a right to stay in that building and hand the lease down to a family member. So what's really the difference between leasehold and fee ownership in that case? I don't know. The problem with home ownership is that the government subsidizes it, and then no one ever sees that apartment again as an affordability tool, as opposed to a rental apartment where the government subsidizes, and this does pertain, this is the good feature of Hunters Point South. The government subsidy in that project, in land and cash subsidy, when someone moves out, goes to another qualified person at a restricted income and a restricted rent, who policymakers have said, you know what, we want to house those folks, as opposed to an individual whose apartment it is. They get what's called an enforcement mortgage. Government places a mortgage on the building. Time passes, that mortgage goes away. And then they just basically own the disparity between restricted and market value. How's that for a lengthy speech?
Do you want to argue with that?
It was a lengthy speech, that's for sure.
Do you have a BlackBerry?
No, I think there's some merit to it. I also think that there's merit to home ownership as well. And I think there are challenges and there are trade-offs in using any government dollar wisely. And I think that any sort of, not just mixed building, but mixed policies and mixed programs are really the smart way to go, and tailoring that to the neighborhood needs and the types of housing. I mean, like, there are a lot of small, like low density, small home, single, 2-family homes across a lot of New York. And Dan was mentioning, the high foreclosure rate, and it hasn't really subsided. And New York has a really lengthy and challenging foreclosure process, and a lot of people are stalling and losing a lot of other kind of financial assets and other things in the process. And I think there's some benefit to thinking differently. I think Adam makes some really valid points, but I also think that there's some value in thinking differently about home ownership and building wealth in different types of neighborhoods across the city, and not everything is a multifamily building that's rent regulated that manages these things in the same way. So I think there needs to be a spectrum, and New York is not, it's 2/3 rental, and it will probably remain that way, but I do think that there's a third that we need to keep thinking about and serving. So I think there's some value to thinking about it more broadly.
And I think there's a different way to talk about this, which is how we're using resources to support different income bands. So we could spend a lot of time talking about 80/20s, right? Bond financed program for developers who are building market rate housing and setting aside 20% for low income, using a tax exempt bond, getting a subsidy there, providing some 4% or some tax credits, which is also available to the developer, and getting a significant property tax abatement. So there are plenty of places where we should look about the depth of subsidy we're providing to certain types of development simply to get low-income units. I think that's a really interesting way to look at what types of incomes we're supporting and
Right.
how.
Right, Dan's example, an 80-20, for the amount of public resources in the form of private activity, tax-exempt bonds, Phipps could build 6 apartments for every one, maybe even 7 apartments for every one 80-20, the 20% apartment built. It's a big number. And a bigger apartment too, by the way, at a lower cost per square foot. In answer to Kay's problem, I don't disagree that home ownership matters to satisfy certain political problems, let's say, of housing type and zoning, because ultimately zoning is a political decision as well. And also home ownership, I do believe, really does make sense if your objective, if you are in a very, very, very difficult economic standpoint, municipal economic standpoint. A good example would be Detroit, Charlotte Street in the Bronx in the late 1970s. It made sense to prime the pump. We need to, I mean, that is economic development writ large. We need to repopulate is really what it took place in the South Bronx, and what is, by the way, still going on. It hasn't quite reached, as one of the biggest landlords in the South Bronx, I can tell you, it hasn't quite reached the maturity level that as a municipal economy, there's no retail economy except in certain nodes of the South Bronx. But in those cases, a home ownership program makes a ton of sense.
Bob, anything to add?
The only comment I'll make in defense of 80-20 and perhaps even Atlantic Yards is that there are areas of downtown Brooklyn which are quickly gentrifying, rapidly gentrifying, and many of these projects may go completely market rate. So by creating some incentive, in some of our buildings, we have one on DeKalb Avenue. The benefit of Brooklyn and what drives some of the high costs now is being at the 3rd largest transportation hub in the city is wonderful for people, no matter what income level you're at. We have another project on DeKalb Avenue that sits on top of the 4, 5, 2, 3 R trains. Again, phenomenal transportation location. And living in the city, you know, that access to transportation. And so, but that's a high cost delivery. So in defense of those things, I think those projects would develop as market rate projects, which many have in Brooklyn. And by creating some incentive, I know it's expensive, but by creating some incentive and then providing 20, 30% affordable housing in, you know, mixed throughout the building, you know, not just at the bottom, but, you know, creating that quality standard. We found, I think, particularly successful, and I think the people that live there really like that as well. So I think some way to preserve some level of affordable housing in areas that I think can quickly gentrify and block everybody out is an opportunity.
And so that's, I didn't mean to criticize the whole program, I was just talking about the depth of subsidy. But that, again, leads to an interesting conversation about how we're going to incent and create affordable housing. Should it be building by building, program by program? Should it be in large-scale RFP so that there's a mix where you can actually scale up the percentage of affordability? How do we do that? Right? What are the different and the best techniques to get the most from the least amount of resources?
It's not just the most and the least. So I'll take Bob's example. I'll have fun with that one. And Phipps, by the way, rented up 88 DeKalb. So,
so he's conflicted out.
Because that's the world we live in, right? If you're going to do it, Phipps wants to be involved in a project like that to make sure so that those who are least likely to get affordable housing in great places get it. And fairness is ensured, so the government's happy. But here's another way of approaching that. Let it go all market rate. Right. Tax it. Use the tax subsidy received in the general fund in the city, because I'm struggling to know where all the subsidy comes for the next mayor's 900,000 unit plan, because everyone's promising, but ain't no one coming up with a way of financing it. So use that subsidy and build more units in, it's not just numbers though, in the Bronx, in central Brooklyn, in southeast Queens, in places where land doesn't cost 90 a foot, 100 a foot, 300 a foot, 800 a foot, whatever people are paying for land. And then secondly, and this is important, I believe in it socially, and here's how. And it may be controversial. The South Bronx needs rebuilding. And Again, if you assume schools are universally mediocre throughout New York City and transit systems are good, which they are, there is a community building aspect to repopulating places that have been underbuilt, have struggled. I'm not worried about DeKalb Avenue. I'm not worried about Delancey Street in Seward Park. It sounds controversial, but, and I also think a second social feature of New York is always, we live in neighborhoods that are ethnic. People settle where they want to settle. It's not an accident that people do that. That's how people live. Creating or social engineering an 80-20, yeah, someone may be approaching that apartment, and since we see hundreds of thousands of applications, we know who's applying for them. It's not always the sort of outcome that we like to think it is. So there, that's what I would say.
Does that create a core for the 1% and push everyone else out?
Wake up and smell the coffee, Kay. Look at Manhattan right now. Who do you think lives here?
I know, but these are the kind of policies that try to not push people out further, right? But try to keep things mixed a little bit.
But
they are more expensive,
here's
but
what
there
I would say
are other
to that.
trade-offs.
You can put it that way. I would put it differently, which is that is what is going on.
Right.
And secondly, I think government is the little Dutch boy trying to stop a flood by building 400 80-20 units in Manhattan. Do you really think that's a game changer?
Right.
Versus 8,000 units in Melrose? I don't think so. And by the way, and the city has got to believe its own rules about that. Melrose in the South Bronx is now beginning to show signs of being a thriving neighborhood and a high demand neighborhood where our Via Verde project is.
That's true.
I
With
think there's
retail active.
Yeah.
Almost.
But yeah,
Well,
that's a different topic.
Improving.
Retail options.
I just
Okay.
think that if I could just,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, good thing you're sitting between us. No, just kidding. I love Adam. No, I think there's a need for both, I would say. I don't think it has to be so dichotomous, and I think that there's some value in trying to, things like the micro units or other things to help to allow people to have options and to have shorter commutes. I think it's really important to build in these other neighborhoods, right? And there are other neighborhoods that haven't had a lot of attention, like in East New York, for example. I think there's some other neighborhoods that need focus in addition to the Bronx. The Bronx has had a lot of attention. So I don't think it has to be so stark, but I do think there's some value to try to keep the mixes.
Okay, you have a good sense of the range of perspectives up here, and so I want to turn to your questions, and it's hard for us to see whose hand is up, so we've got people in both aisles with microphones, and I'm going to turn to them to find the questions. If you would identify yourself and then ask.
My name is Andy Hausler. I'm from California. I'm a housing program manager for a very small city compared to New York. City of Clovis, it's about 100,000 people. I've had the lovely experience of losing our redevelopment funds in California, which has been pretty tragic for affordable housing in California. And one of the things I'm staring down as someone that's been charged with developing affordable housing in a decent-sized city in our region is, how do I do this without the government? How do I do this without, because I see the tax credit products may be changing. We're seeing home funds disappearing. We're seeing CDBG dropping. We're seeing state funds dropping. Our bonds are going away. So how do we take care of our people that need the units? How do we take care of our neighborhoods? So I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Oh, no, we're not starting here.
Well, CRA is a good incentive.
Well, certainly not the magic bullet. So, look, I think, how do you build affordable housing without subsidy is, I think, that question, right? And part of what I think you've heard here, it depends on the dynamics of where you sit. Is it a high-cost market? Is there a market so that there is housing developed, which you might be able to, again, create some inclusionary zoning or some impact type fees, which you could leverage that development to create some affordable housing. The basic proposition, as Adam said, is if you're trying to serve, depending on the incomes of the folks you're trying to serve, and you want to make rents affordable, that's going to require either an operating subsidy or a capital subsidy. And so that's just math, right? To figure out who you're trying to serve, what it will cost to build, and how you produce that housing. I surely think, understanding that the RDAs, which they were not all perfect, right? And there were reasons why there was a backlash against those agencies as a way to distribute housing subsidy, probably worth another discussion. Tax-exempt bonding certainly is a way. That's a sort of an as-of-right opportunity where rates today could be very advantageous. That is a way to produce housing, with or without low-income housing tax credits. Again, California is a super hot market for that type of activity. I think that's where you can look, but I think it's safe to say that, again, depending on the level of incomes, even where you're using tax-exempt bonds and or credits, there is often some other type of subsidy imbued in those structures. So I don't think there's an easy answer. Maybe some of our developer friends can tell us, but it sort of depends on who you're trying to serve. You'll need something.
Cheap land. Does the city own land? If
the land is not worth that much in our region, so when you go in for your tax credit applications, the match is so little that you don't need to go against the larger.
Well, don't ignore modular. And because what you're really doing is saving small amounts as many times as you can. And so if there aren't direct subsidies, you have to try to reduce the costs.
I never really thought about it before. Yours is a city, I didn't hear the name.
City of
Clovis.
Clovis.
Right. If you substitute the word company for city in your model, a company that can't reach scale looks to buy or make. It looks to achieve scale somewhere else. So, and you mentioned just now, there are other cities that we can't, quote, can't compete with. Ask yourself, what do we have that they don't? It's difficult in California where everyone's driving everywhere. It's somewhat easier to make regional planning worthwhile, and it's only regional planning, not regional cooperation in New York. For a long time, I lived in the smallest town in Westchester County, New York, and yet it had 2 villages in it, and the 2 villages couldn't cooperate on police. We had 2 police chiefs, 2 fire chiefs, 2 of everything, 2 taxing jurisdictions. But sitting here and thinking about what your problem is, I wondered whether there's sort of a cross-border collaboration that might achieve advantages you have that another municipality doesn't, and vice versa.
But San Francisco's doing micro units.
Doesn't sound like the type that they
higher
need.
density, higher, better transportation.
The collaboration would go
demand,
something like
land
this:
value.
hey, San Francisco, or whatever the nearest Fresno, we have land, you have home funds. How do we make this work?
And then build a light rail between the two.
Yeah.
Okay,
Maybe a bus.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Heather Gershon. I'm with the Contact Fund and Sea Change Capital Partners. Before that, full disclosure, I was affordable housing developer for CDC in Brooklyn, Fifth Avenue Committee. And I just wanted to get your perspective on something that Adam referenced, which is really looking at how to serve the lower income New Yorkers, folks who are working maybe 2 part-time jobs, maybe they have 1 municipal job as a teacher's aide or a crossing guard. They're at that $35,000 to $45,000 a year income range, and they're steadily employed. But even, and this is not a criticism, even the most affordable housing that we're developing as a municipality is really not affordable to those people who are at the lower end of the income spectrum, even when they're gainfully employed. And there is a real shortage, and I think that's putting it lightly, of operating subsidies to help landlords rent even affordable and rent-stabilized apartments to people who are at the lower end of the income spectrum and who are not who are not disabled or in need of supportive housing. So if I can just ask you to think sort of on the edge of the development box and more speaking to the entrepreneurs in the audience about, what might be the models that we should pursue to sort of get at bridging the gap between what government and development is able to do in a very high-cost city to make affordable housing really accessible to people on the lower end of the income strata.
That is sort of the classic question.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've tried to address some of that with design changes, but
Design only goes so far.
yes,
Yeah.
it does.
I mean, but that, Bob's point, can't be said enough. Affordable housing starts with inexpensive construction. It has to. And come up with those sustainable, meaningful ways of doing that, you've solved part of the biggest part of the problem. If I understood your incomes correctly, that's 60% of, it's two-person household at 35,000?
Sure.
Okay, so it's not quite there, but it's close to qualifying for a development that's financed with low-income housing credits. The single thing I would do would be at the federal level, so we all use, Dan spoke of it earlier, this very valuable tool to raise equity. And this is equity at sub 4% yields. It's pretty crazy, except at Dan's bank.
We don't do those deals.
Yeah, I know. Don't I know it?
But we're careful with the developers we work with.
As you should be. Sub 4% yields. It is a credit against corporate income taxes. And in today's market, corporations pay $1.17 for $1 of credit. Now, granted, there are losses that go along with that, so the tax benefit does achieve a positive yield. But it's super valuable, and it's a federal credit, so it comes from all 50 states. But it's really valuable in high-cost areas like New York and California. And the one thing the government could do, but it ends. If you build an apartment whose household is greater than 60% of area median income, you're done. You make $1 more than that, and all that apartment can't qualify, and all of its basis can't generate the credit, even though $1 more doesn't generate a lot more income to carry debt on the apartment. So I would advocate a band, a spread. And this is not an original idea. A lot of people have come up with this. It could be a range of incomes from 30 to 90% of area median income, so long as you average 60% of area median income in your building. And that would provide a huge array of opportunity for hard-to-house populations, period. We're not even talking my market-ish model that I came up with earlier. We're talking about really hard-to-house.
But I mean, that program didn't work very well 3 years ago when companies weren't paying income tax. Now they are again, and so there are more buyers of the credits.
The fact is that CRA is such a driver, it detaches the value of the credit from the economic reality. So in other words, you're correct, in the depth of the recession, or the height, however you want to look at
Right.
it, some banks did retrench, which allowed us to write a couple of nice checks during a time. But in the main, where you have CRA pressures, the folks will continue to invest. Banks will continue
This
to
is
invest.
an IRS program, so
That's correct.
it's
So assuming
an
tax reform
odd
doesn't happen,
place
we're in good
for housing subsidies to exist, but it's the only thing nationwide that has been available to create new low-income housing.
And there's a state version of that, which is terrific and helps. There's also a new markets tax credit program, which is not always combinable. That finances non-residential housing typically. But I think Adam's point is well taken. That's a great resource. That gets you to that income level, and that's one of the most available tools.
And I would say short of that, which I think is right, because in order to reach deeper affordability or lower income populations is really, really hard, and it's an ongoing struggle for governments to finance because the operating subsidy, as you said, isn't necessarily there. So what the City of New York uses is Section 8 to finance and reach deeper affordability and builds that into the income of the building. But Section 8 has been sequestered, part of sequestration, and that's being cut dramatically. And it can't be the only thing necessarily. So I think on the government side of things, there are probably opportunities to think differently about other operating income potentials. So, I would admit that I don't think we collectively do as good of a job of thinking about how we can merge other operating incomes from other, like social service organizations and think different beyond Section 8 and be smarter. And I think Medicaid redesign is kind of moving in that direction, but there's more opportunity to do those kind of things on the government side. I think we can just be smarter with our funding to be able to achieve this. That might be hard to get to. The other thing that I think could be considered, but is also not necessarily easy, but I think is an opportunity, and these guys might laugh, it's kind of other incomes to the building around like retail and other ways to improve the total income to the building as opposed to the per capita income of the building. But retail can be hard depending on where you are, and it doesn't always subsidize sufficiently. And also mixing and cross-subsidizing from the individual incomes can make a big difference. But it's difficult short of a lot of subsidy.
Okay, if there's another question in the audience down here.
How do we change the perception that affordable housing is an issue just for low income families? I think that it becomes a wider issue for all families, bar at the top, but the mass media seems to keep pushing that the housing bubble is over, housing is more affordable than ever before, since the housing bubble. I've seen collegiate professors push this point as well. I was at a conference earlier last week where they said construction costs are now back down to $20 a square foot, which is what it was pre-bubble, as if that was affordable.
Right.
You know,
Well, there is more discussion of workforce housing, which is perhaps a better term, but
Affordable housing, I mean, there's so many different aspects or facets of that question. Affordable housing has always had an optics or a marketing problem. If you're, we've spent time in DC, and I think if you say to a legislator affordable housing, they just think Section 8 public housing and all that is attendant to that. They're not even aware of low-income housing tax credit projects. We've taken folks to their district and driven them past projects and like, I had no idea that was a low-income housing tax credit project. So I think there's a lot of negative connotation associated with that. But I think more broadly, what this industry has struggled to do and hasn't really achieved well is and it's different for rental versus home ownership, is the economic impact of housing. How affordable housing can be one component of building strong communities. We haven't at all really, other than what Kay just mentioned, we haven't really all talked about the other elements that are necessary for communities that we all could and should be financing: charters, schools, creating jobs, neighborhood serving retail, all that sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot to say about it. I think the industry has not done well. There's sort of a circular firing squad. People are not good about promoting their programs, but these are job creators. Ultimately, they contribute revenue back into a community. They create an enormous stabilizing force for families, which can improve outcomes educationally, in terms of income, in terms of employment. And we all just need to do a better job more cogently expressing that.
okay, let me switch things a little bit. And I just have a couple of final questions, but there's a generational shift occurring in affordable housing or workforce housing. As baby boomers who came out of the activism of the 1960s and 70s are starting to retire. And how do you think the emerging leaders are different, or how they need to be different?
Sure. That question follows well from the prior one in the following way. The affordable Phipps Houses was founded in the progressive era, but it became active during the Great Society programs when housing really was thought of as an anti-poverty program. And many of the tools used were aimed at supplementing incomes of the payers of rent, of the people you wanted to house. It ties together what Heather mentioned earlier and your question just now. And subsidizing someone's income is a really terrible way to do this. And those who think about it from that era do think of it as an anti-poverty measure. The second, and folks who think about housing today think more, pencil it the first time right. make sure it works right the first time. Even if the subsidy is capitalized all up front, make sure that the household you're renting to is maybe just a little rent poor when they start, because again, if you believe, and data bears it out, that restricted rents and incomes, if you tie someone's income to be just a little rent poor when they start, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years down the road, they're not. And incidentally, to the question that preceded this, history shows over time, buildings that Phipps did 15 years ago are now occupied by middle-income households. And it's less degrading. They don't have to come for a strip search, frankly, to qualify themselves to live there on an annual basis, which is what the anti-poverty programs all made people do. And the other big trend is when I joined Phipps in 1989, right out of business school, the development we were working on was 100% subsidized by government. Today, the same developments are 30 to 35% subsidized by the government, capital subsidy. So the rise in market forces, banks like Dan's and private debt as well as equity, has supplanted the government's role. And that's how we think of it. How do we make this more efficient? Meaning greatest affordability for least government subsidy.
Other observations about a generational shift?
You're looking at me, so I guess I'll take that question.
Sure.
I think as much as anything, it's maybe obvious, but because of the internet and technology and ways of organizing and sharing information and thinking differently, I think people are better equipped and better connected and organizing. If you're talking about true kind of community development and organizing and thinking, I think that Occupy Wall Street is a great example, and I think there are a lot of younger people mobilized by that sort of initiative, and I think it encourages more comprehensive and diverse thinking, and I think it has the seed of helping people think about neighborhoods and community development, and not just housing, but larger needs and opportunities. So it's kind of a generic response, but I think it's important, and I think it's a mind shift and how people think about things, but also how they're operating in a more sort of collective, kind of diverse, comprehensive sort of way, which I think we'll see sort of the outcomes of that over the next sort of decade or so.
Well, and certainly our experience at Columbia is that more MBAs are going into social enterprise broadly, but including real estate and affordable housing.
That's pandering to the audience. I would just quickly say a couple things. One is to Adam's point, mission. If we think back about, again, those mission-driven developers who came out of the anti-poverty movement versus development today, I'd say two things. One is mission does not mean that housing developers need to do everything. This industry has expanded. It's much more complicated. You have developers you had previously folks who thought they needed to develop, market, manage, do all elements of it, and I think there are a few who can do that well. Phipps is one of them. You need to get to scale, so scale is one answer, and I think different delivery models and or collaborations or joint ventures, which previously may have been unthinkable from an ideological point of view, are now essential, and that just means you can even work with the private sector and have them deliver part of what you're doing, because these buildings have significant income streams, or some do. The last thing I would say, again, a reference to the NBA, is the financing structures to get a project like this done are so incredibly complicated. You just need a law degree, a business degree, and 2 other degrees to make something like this work. So I think the better technically equipped people are, the more effective they'll be.
Just one comment that I would make on the whole affordable housing thing too. I think there is a responsibility to look at this in the larger context. You can't just solve it on a housing project. It really is the access to retail, transportation, to schools and neighborhoods. If you look at some of the most recent RFP, Seward Park, for instance, making a place for the marketplace was a big part of that RFP, and an important part of that RFP to build stabilization in that community. I think finding an element of business, there was an office component of that particular one. And I think to the extent that you could be successful, I think trying to create just an affordable community in one place becomes difficult, and in the larger context, the mix of community, of higher to middle, while you don't solve as many housing issues at once, you do create a more stabilized environment. I do think there is a place for the teacher to live within the community and not commute from the Bronx to teach a class in Brooklyn. So I think there's just some real validity to that mix of it. And you can get that by addressing both the retail and business needs within that component. I think that's the greatest hope really for affordable housing, is trying to incorporate it in parts and leverage some of the great inertia that the city has right now.
Well, I think that's a very good summary, and unfortunately our time is up. So would you join me in thanking the panel? Thanks for coming.